In 1955, a woman could walk into a bank, hand over proof of her salary, her savings, her entire financial history, and still be told she needed a man's signature to borrow money, not because of a law, because of an assumption. The assumption that she would get pregnant, quit her job, and become someone else's problem. So the bank simply cut her salary in half on paper, just like that, and handed the loan application back across the desk. That's called wage discounting. And in 1955, it was completely standard practice. No apology, no legal challenge, no recourse. Banks weren't breaking any rules. They were following them. Now here's the thing. We tend to think we already know what life was like in the 1950s. We've seen the photographs, the cinched waists, the pearl necklaces, the gleaming Chevrolets in suburban driveways. We've watched the television shows. We've heard the phrase simpler times so many times it's practically a reflex. But the life of a single woman in 1955 was not simple. It was an obstacle course built by a society that had decided, at every level, from the government to the bank to the boarding house, that an unmarried woman was a problem to be solved. And the solution was always the same: find a husband. What you're about to discover is not the 1955 of nostalgia. It's the 1955 of alarm clocks at 7 in the morning, typing pools that sounded like factories, house matrons who locked the front door at 10 o'clock sharp, and a medical establishment that diagnosed female frustration as a psychiatric disorder. This is what it was actually like. The number that defined everything. Let's start with a number, 20.2. That was the median age at which American women got married in the mid-1950s, the lowest in recorded U.S. history. Not 25, not 23, 20 years old, barely out of high school. And society didn't see that as young. Society saw anything older as a warning sign. If you were a woman and you hadn't secured an engagement ring by your senior year of high school or college, people started to worry. Not about you exactly, about what you represented. By 22, the whispers would begin. By 25, the pity would be open and undisguised. By 30, you were essentially written off as an old maid, a word that carried the full weight of social failure, personal deficiency, and wasted womanhood. That wasn't just cultural pressure. It was institutional pressure, psychological pressure, economic pressure. Every single structure in American society in 1955 was designed to funnel a young woman toward early marriage. And if you failed to go through that funnel on schedule, the system had very little use for you. But here is the contradiction at the heart of this story. Millions of women didn't marry young. Millions of women worked, lived alone in cities, managed their own money, navigated their own lives. And the world made it as difficult as possible at every single turn. 7 o'clock in the morning. Imagine you are 22 years old. You live in New York City. You have a job as a copy typist at an engineering firm. You are, by every reasonable measure, an independent adult woman. Your alarm goes off at 7. You don't stretch in your own apartment. You don't shuffle to your own kitchen. You open your eyes in a single room at a female-only residential hotel, a room just large enough for a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a chair. The walls are thin. You can hear the woman next door already moving around. You gather your clothes for the day and walk down the hallway to the shared ironing room. Hot plates and irons are strictly banned in individual bedrooms. Fire hazard, the management says. So every morning, you iron your blouse in a room you share with a dozen other women. Then you wash in a communal bathroom, waiting your turn at the mirror alongside your neighbors. Dressing is not a casual process. You put on a girdle first, constricting, structured, unyielding, then nylon stockings attached to a garter belt, a stiff starched blouse, a mid-calf skirt, heels. You apply your full face of makeup. You set your hair in structured waves. Pants are not an option. Bare legs are not an option. A bare face is not an option. This is not vanity. This is the uniform. And deviating from the uniform has consequences. At work, on the street, in the eyes of every person who decides whether you are respectable or not. After a quick breakfast of toast and coffee in the shared basement kitchen, you sign yourself out in the lobby ledger. Yes, there is a ledger, and yes, you are required to log your comings and goings, and you step out into the morning. The typing pool. You can't afford a car. On a median female salary of $1,100 a year, that's roughly $2,500 in today's money, a personal automobile is simply not within reach. The average new home in 1955 costs $18,400, which is more than 16 years of your gross income. A car is almost as impossible. So you walk to the subway. On the train, you sit quietly, eyes downcast. Women on public transit in 1955 do not make prolonged eye contact with strangers. Forwardness is penalized. You read a magazine and you wait. By 8:45, you arrive at the corporate offices. You do not have your own office or your own desk in a quiet corner. You take your seat in the typing pool. A vast open hall lined with rows of identical metal desks, all facing forward toward the elevated platform where the department supervisor sits, watching. At 9 o'clock, the room explodes into sound, manual typewriters. Dozens of them, all firing at once, filling the air with a noise that you can feel in your chest. There is no autocorrect. There is no delete key. There is no digital memory of any kind. Every keystroke is permanent, or close to it. Your desk is piled with handwritten documents, engineering specifications, business letters, internal memos. Because the photocopier has not yet been invented for office use, every single document you type must be produced in 5 copies simultaneously. You feed carbon paper between 5 thin sheets, roll them into the typewriter as one thick bundle, and begin. If you make an error, and you will make errors because these keys require real physical force, and there are no visual guides, no spell check, no second chances, you must stop. Roll the paper up carefully, take your circular rubber eraser, and correct the mistake individually on all 5 sheets, one by one, without tearing the thin paper. Then realign everything and continue. The supervisor sends back anything imperfect. If that happens after 5 o'clock, you stay late. In the afternoon, you collect the black wax cylinders from the executive's dictaphone machines. These are audio recording devices that capture dictation onto thick, heavy cylinders of wax. You carry them to the senior typists. Then, once the letters are transcribed, you take the used cylinders to a mechanical shaving machine. The machine peels away a thin layer of wax, erasing the recording, smoothing the surface so the cylinder can be returned to the executive and used again tomorrow. That is how audio files are deleted in 1955. You shave them off with a blade. You also manage the telephone switchboard when needed, a physical board of metal jacks and brass-tipped cords, where you match plugs to the correct extension by watching small mechanical shutters called doll's eyes flip open and closed to signal which lines are active. There is no digital routing. Every call passes through your hands. You work from 9 in the morning to 5:30 in the evening, every weekday, plus a mandatory half-day on Saturday, 9 to 1. That is your week. The money problem. Here is where things get genuinely shocking, even by the standards of the era. The median female annual income in 1955 was $1,100. The median male income was $3,400. That is not a small gap. That is a ratio of roughly 1 to 3, meaning a woman doing comparable work brought home about a third of what her male colleague earned. This wasn't a secret. It wasn't even controversial. The accepted explanation was that men were breadwinners who required a family wage to support a household. Women, the reasoning went, were secondary earners, working for pocket money, for entertainment, for personal spending, not for survival, not for independence. So they didn't need to be paid like adults with real financial obligations. For women of color, the picture was even starker. Their median annual income was $970, and the vast majority were locked out of corporate offices entirely, confined to domestic service and laundry work by a combination of racial segregation and structural discrimination that operated completely independently of whatever meager legal protections existed on paper. Now, here is something that surprises most people. Women in 1955 could legally open a bank account. Under long-standing property laws dating back to the 19th century, unmarried, widowed, and divorced women had the right to hold savings accounts and checking accounts in their own names. That part of the popular mythology is wrong, but the credit system was a different story entirely. Before the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, nearly 2 decades away, financial institutions were legally permitted to discriminate based on sex and marital status whenever and however they chose. Want a credit card? You need a male cosigner, a father, a brother, a husband. Any man would do as long as he was a man. Want a car loan? Same requirement. Want a mortgage? The bank would take your salary, your employment history, your entire financial profile, and then cut the number in half before calculating what you could borrow, because as a woman of childbearing age, you were assumed to be a temporary worker who might leave the workforce at any moment. That's wage discounting, and it was standard industry practice. Let's make that concrete. A new home in suburban America in 1955 cost about $1,400. A married couple could buy one with a monthly mortgage payment of around $49. A single woman on $1,900 a year, after the bank had discounted her salary to $550 on paper, could not get within a mile of that transaction. In New York City, renting a small apartment cost between $49 and $88 a month. On a salary of $1,100, that's nearly half of her gross income before taxes, food, clothing, or transportation. For many women, independent apartment living was simply not financially possible, which is how the boarding house became the dominant housing option for single working women, and why that option came with rules. The house with rules. The boarding house, or single-room occupancy residential hotel, was not just a place to sleep. It was a social institution designed specifically to reassure parents that their daughter's moral virtue was being protected in the dangerous city. At the working-class end of the spectrum, there was the YWCA, sparse, institutional, functional. A small room, a shared hallway bathroom, a communal kitchen. Quiet hours enforced, male visitors strictly prohibited above the ground floor. At the upper end of the spectrum was the Barbizon Hotel for women on 63rd Street in Manhattan, a 23-story Gothic brick tower that became one of the most famous addresses in New York City. Future luminaries including Grace Kelly, Sylvia Plath, and Joan Didion passed through its doors. It was nicknamed the Dollhouse. And the nickname was more accurate than it sounds, because here is what the Barbizon actually was: a system. When you applied, the front desk clerk assessed you. Not your references, not your employment history, you, your age, your appearance, your presentation. Based on that assessment, you were placed in one of 3 groups. Group A meant you were young and attractive. Private room, good floor, full amenities. Group B meant slightly older or slightly less impressive. Small room, shared hallway bath. Group C meant over 35 or deemed undesirable in some other way. Group C meant rejection. And if you were black, none of this applied to you at all. The Barbizon maintained an explicit whites-only admissions policy until 1956. A black woman, no matter her income, her education, her professional accomplishments, was simply turned away at the door. For the women who did get in, any of the boarding houses, not just the Barbizon, the rules were extensive. Men were not allowed past the lobby. Curfews were standard. The main door locked at 10 p.m., sometimes midnight. You signed in and out of a lobby ledger, and your parents could request copies of those records. Hot plates, kettles, and irons were banned in individual bedrooms. Violating these rules meant immediate eviction. You paid rent to live under these conditions. You were a legal adult paying for private accommodation. And you had roughly the autonomy of a student in a strict dormitory. That was the deal. Respectability came at a price, and the price was surveillance. 5:30, and the long evening. The office closes at 5:30. You stop at a corner grocery on the way home. Not for a week's worth of food, but for tonight's dinner. You have no private refrigerator. You cannot store fresh meat or produce. Everything is bought daily in single portions. In 1953, a company called CA, Swanson & Sons, had introduced something new, the frozen TV dinner. By 1955, it had become a genuine phenomenon. For 98 cents, you could buy a pre-portioned aluminum tray of turkey, cornbread dressing, peas, and sweet potatoes, packaged in a box designed to look exactly like a miniature television set, complete with dials printed on the side. Swanson sold 10 million of the turkey version alone in its first year. By 1955, they had added beef and fried chicken. The marketing of the TV dinner was a masterclass in contradiction. Magazine advertisements aimed at women showed stylish, modern figures in smart suits, pulling these trays from shopping bags, with copy that framed the convenience meal as liberation, freedom from hours of domestic drudgery. Meanwhile, television commercials aimed at men showed happy husbands praising their wives for never panicking when dinner plans changed. The product was the same. The message was entirely different, depending on who was watching. You heat your tray in the communal kitchen, carry it back, and eat. If you want to call your mother or a friend, you go to the hallway phone booth. There are no private telephones in the bedrooms. The telephone line is a shared party line, connected to multiple other households in the building, and possibly the block. You pick up the receiver and sometimes hear someone else already in conversation. You wait. When the line clears, you speak quickly. The unwritten rule, and in some places, the written rule, is 3 minutes maximum, because a dozen other residents are waiting for access to the same wire, because somewhere on the line is a family that might need to call an emergency service, because monopolizing the party line is considered a social offense serious enough to get you ostracized in your own building. And while you talk, you are aware that anyone else on the line can quietly lift their receiver and listen. There is no privacy on a party line. Your conversation with your mother about your day, with a friend about a date you went on, any of it could be overheard by a neighbor at any moment. That is simply the condition of communication in 1955. By 8:30, you are in your room washing your undergarments by hand in the communal utility sinks. There is no laundry machine accessible to you. And wrapping your damp hair in metal pin curls that will press uncomfortably against your scalp all night. They will give you the structured waves required for tomorrow's public appearance. By 10, the main door is locked and your light is out. You fall asleep listening to the thin walls breathe around you, full of other women navigating the exact same path. The rules of romance. Now, all of this, the work, the boarding house, the penny-precise budget, existed alongside the overwhelming cultural expectation that your real goal was marriage, not career advancement, not personal fulfillment, marriage. Dating in 1955 was a structured, hierarchical ritual. Men initiated all contact. Men planned and paid for everything. A woman who showed romantic forwardness, who suggested a date, who reached for the bill, was immediately labeled easy or fast, which in 1955 meant she lacked the moral character required of a future wife. That label followed a woman. At restaurants, the etiquette went further. A woman was not supposed to place her own order with the waiter. She was expected to whisper her selection to her male companion, who would then convey it to the staff. She had a voice at the table, but the world was not supposed to hear it directly. The rules extended to the smallest physical details. Etiquette guides of the era specified that a woman could not bite into a whole plum at the table. The fruit had to be dissected in her dish first, the pits set aside separately, then the pieces eaten one at a time. Celery, radishes, cheese, all had to be cut before eating. These weren't suggestions. They were tests of refinement that people applied and judged, consciously or not, on every date. Now here is something that might surprise you. When it came to going steady, the exclusive, formalized, romantic relationship symbolized by the exchange of Letterman jackets and class rings, you might assume that parents and community leaders encouraged it as wholesome. They absolutely did not. In 1955, going steady was considered by many adults, educators, and religious authorities to be a national crisis. Their concern was that early exclusivity led to emotional isolation and premature physical intimacy. The approved alternative, actively promoted by advice columnists and guidance counselors, was casual dating, going out with 3 or 4 different people every weekend, developing what they called mate selection skills before forming any deep attachment. Pop culture would later remember the Letterman jacket exchange as an innocent, adult-approved milestone. That is almost exactly backward. The adults of 1955 found the whole thing alarming. The politics of the kitchen. There is something else operating underneath all of this, something that gives these social pressures a sharper edge than simple tradition. The nuclear family in 1955 was not just a personal choice. It was a geopolitical weapon. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a Cold War that touched every corner of American life, including domestic expectations for women. American propaganda of the era explicitly contrasted the image of the feminine American housewife, soft, well-dressed, presiding over a gleaming kitchen full of modern appliances, with the image of the Soviet woman, drab, overworked, laboring in factories alongside men, stripped of her femininity by communist ideology. The message was clear. A woman who stayed home was a patriot. A woman who worked was approximating the Soviet model. A woman who remained unmarried past her early 20s was, within this framework, not just socially unusual. She was a small act of defiance against the American way of life, a neurotic old maid in the language of the era, a psychological failure, a threat, however minor, to national stability. This is not an exaggeration. Popular texts of the 1950s explicitly linked career ambition in women to mental illness. A 1947 book called Modern Woman, The Lost Sex, which remained widely influential well into the 1950s, argued that unmarried, independent women who rejected domesticity were exhibiting symptoms of psychiatric disorder, and the medical establishment was not far behind. What they called madness. If a single woman in 1955 expressed deep unhappiness with her salary, her limited career options, her inability to get a loan, the curfew at her boarding house, if she expressed any of this with the wrong level of intensity, she risked a diagnosis. Psychiatric medicine in 1955 had a name for female frustration, hysterical neurosis, for female anger, angry woman syndrome, a category pioneered by Dr. Nathan Rickels specifically to pathologize women who expressed frustration with their subordinate social status, for persistent unhappiness in women who resisted traditional gender roles, uterine melancholy, attributed, with a straight face, to a lack of a normal sexual life within marriage. The treatments available were not gentle. Women who failed to conform to prescribed gender roles faced forced institutionalization, heavy sedation, electroconvulsive therapy, in the most severe cases lobotomy, a surgical procedure that destroyed portions of the brain's frontal lobe, leaving patients permanently impaired. The case of Rosemary Kennedy, lobotomized in 1941 at her father's request to address mood swings and mild intellectual disability, left her institutionalized for the rest of her life. Her case was not unique. It was simply more visible than most. The psychological message to single women was consistent and explicit. Your discontent is not a rational response to an unjust system. It is a symptom. The system is fine. You are broken. What wasn't supposed to exist. Here is a truth that the public culture of 1955 worked very hard to suppress. Premarital sex was common. not universal, not openly discussed, not culturally celebrated, but common. Young people found ways, as they always have. The problem was that reliable contraception for unmarried women was not just socially discouraged. In many states, it was a felony. Century-old Comstock anti-obscenity laws remained active in 30 states in 1955. They criminalized the sale, advertisement, and distribution of contraceptives. In Connecticut, the actual use of birth control was illegal, even for married couples in their own bedrooms. For an unmarried woman, purchasing a condom or a diaphragm could mean criminal prosecution. The birth control pill would not receive FDA approval until 1960, and even then it would be prescribed only for married women. Unmarried women would not gain legal access to contraception until 1972. So what did single women do? They improvised. They navigated a thriving underground. One strategy was known as prescribing passing. A single woman would borrow a wedding ring from a married friend and wear it to a doctor's appointment, pretending to be married in order to obtain a prescription for a diaphragm. It was a small act of deception, with potentially large legal consequences if discovered. Another strategy involved products sold openly in drugstores under deliberately ambiguous packaging. Companies marketed highly toxic chemical douches using coded language, female hygiene, regulation of menses, that allowed them to bypass federal obscenity laws while making the actual purpose unmistakably clear to women who needed them. These products were used as improvised spermicides and abortifacients. They were dangerous. They caused severe internal burns. Women used them anyway because there was nothing else. And if all of this failed, if a young woman became pregnant outside of marriage, the consequences were absolute and swift. She was removed from school or fired from her job immediately. She was typically sent away to a distant relative's home or to one of the secretive residential institutions euphemistically called homes for wayward girls, to hide the family's shame from the community. Once the child was born, she was heavily pressured or simply forced to surrender the infant for adoption. Then she returned home, and the subject was never spoken of again. The trauma was carried in silence, sometimes for decades. This happened to thousands of women every year. It was systematic, and it was invisible by design. What we usually get wrong. When modern audiences think about single women in the 1950s, they tend to fall into one of two equally inaccurate pictures. The first is the helpless picture, a woman with no rights, no money, no agency, entirely dependent on men for every aspect of her life. This isn't quite right. Women could hold bank accounts, they could sign contracts, they could own property. Millions of them worked. Female labor force participation actually rose steadily throughout the 1950s, even as the culture loudly insisted women belonged at home. The second is the glamorous picture. The working girl in the city, independent and stylish, a kind of proto-sex, and the city fantasy projected backward onto the decade. This is also wrong. The working girl of 1955 lived in a Spartan shared room with a 10 p.m. curfew, washed her own laundry in a communal sink every night, ate TV dinners because she couldn't afford better and had nowhere to cook anyway, and worried constantly about remaining unmarried long enough to be considered an old maid. The reality was neither helpless nor glamorous. It was a system of relentless, low-grade constraint. Not a locked cage, but a room where every door required a particular kind of key that women simply weren't given. The credit card you couldn't get without a man's signature. The loan that assumed you'd be pregnant by next year. The boarding house that graded your looks before deciding whether you deserved a private bathroom. The diagnosis waiting for you if you complained too loudly. These were not dramatic, single acts of oppression. They were the texture of daily life. And that texture is what gets flattened when we reduce the 1950s to either a golden age or a horror story. What was good? And yet, and this matters, life was not without pleasure, without community, without genuine joy. On weekday evenings after dinner, the women of the boarding house gathered in the communal lounge. By 1955, television had established itself as the dominant medium in American life, with close to 40 million households owning a set. Individual rooms didn't have TVs. They were expensive, and the rooms were small. But the shared lounges did. Women gathered to watch I Love Lucy, Wagon Train, American Bandstand. There was something in those evenings, even in the communal and constrained space of a residential hotel, that was genuinely its own kind of freedom. On weekends, they went to the movies. Hollywood in 1955 was at the peak of its star-driven era. Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, Grace Kelly, Marlon Brando. Cinema was cheap, accessible, and intensely social. It was also, like the magazines, deeply contradictory in how it portrayed women. The same culture that pushed marriage and domesticity as the only legitimate female destiny also produced Gloria Graham and Bette Davis and Barbara Stanwyck. Women on screen who were complicated, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. A dozen eggs cost 36 to 55 cents. A pound of white bread was 9 cents. A can of Campbell's tomato soup was a dime. A gallon of gasoline was 27 cents. Not that most women could afford a car to put it in, but the material world was, in certain very limited ways, remarkably affordable if your needs were minimal enough. There was friendship, too. Deep, enduring, structurally important friendship between women. The kind that forms when you are all navigating the same impossible maze and you figure it out together. The women in those typing pools and boarding houses were not passive recipients of their conditions. They complained, they strategized, they laughed, they built lives inside the constraints handed to them. That is its own form of resilience, and it deserves to be named. What changed and what didn't? Between 1955 and today, the legal landscape shifted almost completely. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 made it illegal to discriminate in lending based on sex or marital status. The Equal Pay Act of 1963, though imperfectly enforced, established the principle of equal wages for equal work. The 1968 Fair Housing Act made it illegal for landlords to refuse to lease to women on the basis of gender alone. The birth control pill and the eventual repeal of Comstock laws gave women legal access to contraception. The median age of first marriage for women climbed from 20.2 in the mid-1950s to 28 by 2022. Each of those changes represents an enormous hard-won shift in what was possible for women. Each one was fought for, often for years or decades, by people who were told at the time that the current system was natural and reasonable and fine. But it is worth sitting with what the 1955 system tells us about how constraint actually works. It rarely announces itself. It doesn't need to. It operates through the ordinary. Through the bank teller who shrugs and says he needs a cosigner, through the doctor who gives you a strange look when you ask certain questions, through the house matron who locks the door at 10 o'clock as if that is simply the natural order of things. The women of 1955 were not living in a fairy tale, and they were not living in a dystopia. They were living in Tuesday. And Tuesday came with a typing pool that clattered like a factory floor, a boarding house with thin walls and thinner rules, a salary that was 1/3 of the man sitting one floor above her, and a medical establishment ready to diagnose her frustration as illness. They got up at 7 anyway. They ironed their blouses in the shared ironing room. They walked to the subway, kept their eyes down, found their seats, and then some of them, quietly, persistently, over years and decades, started asking why the door was locked in the first place. That question, it turns out, changed everything.